And of course, sin has had its ramifications, all of them bad, ever since. And it wasn't so long after that that our second subject, which is sacrifice, came up. We don't know how long it was after the expulsion from the garden, but it wasn't a long, long time until Cain and Abel brought sacrifice into the world. I'm in Genesis chapter 4, the first 5 verses. Adam knew Eve, his wife. She conceived and bore Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep. Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, see, there's that time, an indefinite period, but not a long time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Hebrew word is the same for both offerings, whether plant or animal. Notice that Cain was a farmer, so he brought something from the ground. Abel was a shepherd, brought something from the flock. So each offered of the fruits of his labor, and that's part of sacrifice, because the offering had to be something that the owner owned to offer. Think of the story that Nathan told David about the man who was going to serve his friends. And instead of offering out of his own flock, and he was rich, he took that pet lamb that belonged to a man and killed it and served it to his friends. Well, that's sort of the same idea as if I were going to offer a sacrifice, but I didn't want to give up one of my own lambs, so I took one from Damon. What's the cost to me? Nothing. A sacrifice has to cost something. They both sacrificed, but God was not pleased with Cain's sacrifice, and the answer to that isn't stated. Why? Some commentators suggest that maybe Cain's attitude was poor, that he begrudged it. And I suppose that's possible. But what I think is more likely is that there was a command that was given that is not stated, and Abel, getting my A's mixed up, Abel obeyed it, and Cain did not. I'll give you support for that argument. And I'm not smart enough to have originated it. It came from the late Wayne Jackson in a magazine called Christian Courier, which is available online, and I recommend it to you. He said the fact that both brothers brought a sacrifice at the same time indicates a command from God to do it. And probably what God wanted was also stated. And we do know from Hebrews 11 and verse 4 that by faith Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain. So probably there was a command that was given that Cain chose to disregard. And God wasn't pleased. Well, here's the beginning of sacrifice in the first generation born on this earth. And it spread widely. It was practiced very soon and continued to be in every known ancient culture. And why would that be? Why would a person sacrifice in the first place? Well, they probably had a belief that there was something greater than I am, and I need to appease it or to please it. And so sacrifice became common in every culture. The earliest people probably had a concept of what was right and what was wrong. Think of Adam and Eve. Now, granted, they disobeyed a command, but even before God said anything to them, they knew that they had done wrong. And that idea is brought out in Romans chapter 2, where Paul wrote about people, this is people before the time of Christ, who did not have the law, but who by nature did the things commanded in the law. Then that became a law to them. They were following the law, its precepts in general, without even having it. And so sacrifice came into play. The Old International Standard Bible Encyclopedia puts it this way: man felt himself, he felt that obligation, under liability to punishment or to death. The animal was his, it was alive, it was valuable. And perchance the God, whatever that God was, would accept that life in place of his. That's what sacrifice is. He felt that it would be accepted, and thus the animal was sacrificed, and the offerer, in a sense, gave up part of himself. Common throughout history. Sacrificial systems, common, even before the time of Abraham. Egypt, there were sacrifices. 2000, 3000 BC, they had sacrificial systems. Temples in Babylon, some of them with morning and afternoon sacrifices.
Noah made his sacrifice. Right?
Noah sacrificed as well, long before the time of Abraham. And nomadic tribes in the Middle East were sacrificing. And as so often happens, religious things get corrupted. And God wanted animal sacrifice. But before long, what did people turn to? Human sacrifice. The Canaanite neighbors of Israel were doing that even before they entered the land, especially to the god of the Ammonites, Molech. And that spilled over into God's people. Ahaz, who was a king of Judah, sacrificed his son. And the people of Israel and Judah apparently did it to some extent, but we know that Ahaz did. And relatively speaking, it became a fairly modern thing. The Mayas, the Aztecs, in Mexico and Central America practiced human sacrifice. When did it end? By coincidence, 500 years ago this year, in 1521, Cortez of Spain conquered those people, and human sacrifice ended 500 years ago. Now, that was in Central America. I suppose it's possible that it exists today somewhere in the world. I don't know. Do any of you know? Damon, you are nodding. Does it?
Well, within 20 years, I've read sacrifices in the paper of the priest who was jailed for the practice.
Damon is saying not so long ago he's read of it. Things get corrupted. And unfortunately, when religion gets corrupted, it tends to stay that way. And apparently that is still the case. So, sacrifice came in. We have to assume that God commanded it. But in the law of Moses, there's no assumption. It's stated, specifically commanded, and in great detail, which is indicating the importance of sacrifice to the people of God. It's commanded in the opening chapters of the book of Leviticus. And you probably have just moaned, oh dear, I hope we're not going to read the book of Leviticus. Well, we're not. But the first 7 chapters of Leviticus are devoted entirely to sacrifices. And they are summarized, if you want to turn there, or whether you really want to or not, why don't you? To Leviticus chapter 7, the final verses of the chapter. This is the law of the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, the trespass offering, the consecrations, and the sacrifice of the peace offering, which the Lord commanded Moses on Mount Sinai on the day when he commanded the children of Israel to offer their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. Look at that list. Most of the offerings, as you would imagine, were bloody. The burnt offering, peace, sin, guilt, and the perpetual offering, which is not described in this list, but which is commanded. They all involve blood. Let's start with the burnt offering. That's Leviticus chapter 1. The burnt offering was voluntary. You didn't have to do it. Offering came from a Hebrew word meaning to approach or to draw near. The idea of a superior is implied there. And at that time, nobody would approach a superior without a gift in hand. As I was reviewing, I thought of the story of Saul. You may recall in 1 Samuel chapter 9, the donkeys belonging to Saul's father had gotten loose. And Saul and his servant were looking for them, and they weren't coming up with anything. I mean, you probably misplaced your car keys, but they had been looking for 3 days. If you hadn't found your car keys in 3 days, you have a real problem. Well, finally, Saul said, we need to go back home because my dad is not going to be worried so much about the donkeys. He's going to be worried about what happened to us. And the servant said, well, there's a man of God, a prophet, his name was Samuel, over here. Let's go talk to him. And Saul said, well, but I don't have any gift to take him. That's the idea here of approaching a superior. And so the servant said, well, I got a little silver here. We can go do it with that. That's the idea of approaching. And that was the idea of the burnt offering. The burnt offering was for the individual. He would make atonement. Or perhaps it's to demonstrate that he was totally dedicated to God. What could he offer? Unblemished, of course. A male bull, a ram, a goat, or if he were poor, pigeons or doves. He would bring it to the place where the priest was. He would lay his hand on the head of the offering. What's he doing there? He's symbolizing, I'm identifying myself with this offering. I am transferring the guilt that I have to this offering. And then the person making the offering killed the animal. And then the priest took over from there, and they did the other part of the work. Most important thing here was attitude, not so much value, because you had a descending price tag, really. Bull, ram, goat, birds, going down. But no one was exempt from the need to sacrifice. Then they took the blood, throw the blood against the altar. The altar was outside, and the entire carcass was burnt on the altar. That's in chapter 6 and verse 9. The burnt offering was burnt overnight, completely consumed, probably showing submission to God's will. And although this command was long after the time of Noah that Jim referred to, look back at Genesis chapter 8. This is after the flood, long before the law was given. And what Noah did. Noah built an altar to the Lord, took of every clean animal, every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. And then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. A pleasing odor from the sacrifices, the whole burnt offering. That's the role that Christ fulfilled for us. From Ephesians 5 and verse 2, walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Christ offered for us. And the idea continues. What is that aroma today? It is the prayers of the saints. We read that in Revelation chapter 8. Our prayers go up to God as a sweet smell. That's the burnt offering. The peace offering. Leviticus chapter 3. Again, it was voluntary. It was for the individual. He would do it to express gratitude or to offer something to God. Again, it had to be an unblemished animal from the herd, cattle, or from the flock, sheep family. But it could be female, male or female, was good for the peace offering. Like before, kill the animal, collect the blood, throw it against the altar. And the fat on the entrails, remember that Abel offered the fat? The fat on the entrails and some of the organs were burnt on the altar. Now, in the case of the burnt offering, they burnt the whole thing. Here, just part of it. And incidentally, there is one verse in Leviticus 3, chapter 5, that Leviticus 3, verse 5, associates the burnt offering and the peace offering. Because the burnt offering was on the altar, and the peace offering was burnt on top of it. I don't know if it was commanded that way or if it was just coincidental, but that's the way it was done. And again, it shows that peace with God requires blood. There is no remission without the shedding of blood. Hebrews 9 and verse 22. Unlike the burnt offering, most of the peace offering was eaten. Some of it was eaten by the priests, most of it by the person who offered it. So he could take it home and he could have a fellowship meal. That was the only offering that the offerer would share in. And the idea of fellowship is bound up within it. Our fellowship meals today are similar in many ways as we share what we have. So the peace offering. We have peace with God through the blood of Jesus Christ. Romans 5 and verse 1. And because we have peace with God, that's a vertical relationship, we have horizontal relationships, peace with our brethren. And that was commemorated in the peace offering. Chapter 4 and most of chapter 5 deal with the sin offering. Various reasons for it. One commentator speculated that it may have had to do with violation of ceremonial laws, which he didn't define. It was for the person who sinned unwittingly. That's not an expression we usually use. How about unintentionally? Burton Kaufman took that a little farther in his commentary. He said, rashly, but without premeditation. And that, we read about that in accounts of crimes. When
that can be identified as sins in ignorance, which I'm guilty.
Could be, but rashly without premeditation is probably not. They did it, but something just snapped. And you have read of people who have attacked somebody because they got provoked and before they thought they did. It's often a big mistake to say the first thing that comes into your mind. It can have greater consequences if you do the first thing that you think of. That can put you in trouble with the law. And that may be what Kaufman has in mind. And there were tiers for that, because several examples are given in this chapter. First off is of the priest, who, if the priest sins, from chapter 4 and verse 3, he brings guilt upon the people, not just himself. And he would offer a young bull, and some of the blood of that was taken into the tabernacle and offered on the horns of the altar of incense. And some of it, the priest would dip his finger in the blood and he would sprinkle it before the veil. I don't know what he sprinkled it on, but he would sprinkle it. Most of it was burnt outside, thrown out at the base of the offering. The fat, again, burnt. And for the sin offering, the rest of that bull was taken outside the gate and burnt. There is sort of a fulfillment of that in Hebrews chapter 13. If you want to turn to Hebrews 13, starting at verse 11, the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary, remember some of that was taken in and put on the altar of incense, by the high priest for sin, are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore, let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. Calvary, at least the site that seems to be the site of the crucifixion, was outside of the walls of Jerusalem at the time. So Jesus suffered outside the camp. It's probably significance there. Sin is repulsive to God. I think we'd agree with that. So Jesus suffered outside the camp, outside of the city. Well, that was for the priest. For the people as a group, same idea, a young bull. But representing the people, the elders, you'll recall there were 70 of them. I don't know how many of them could get around in this circle to do it, but some of them did. The elders would lay their hands on the sacrifice. They are representing the people. So the people's sins would be passed through the elders onto the bull. All of them were included. Maybe not all of them sinned, probably not, but they were all included in this action. And then the blood was taken care of. Some of it went in on the priest's fingers before the veil. Some of it on the horns of the altar of incense within the tabernacle. Most of it poured out outside. And all of the fat was burnt. I remember when I was growing up, I was just grossed out by the idea of eating fat. Now I can tolerate a little of it, provided it's cooked, well cooked. You like bacon, you know bacon is marbled, even a little bit of ham fat. But if it's not cooked, it's not very good. Well, the fat was regarded as being the most valuable part of the meat. Now, the fact that God wanted the fat and that the children of Israel were commanded not to eat fat indicates that the best that they had was to be offered. Can we do anything less but offer to God the best that we have? So that's the people as a group. Then you have a ruler. This was long before the times of kings. I don't think he's talking about that. He's probably talking about a leading man in the family. You recall seeing some of those lists in the Pentateuch. The leading man, the head of the family, the head of the tribe. I'm sure that's what he had in mind. But it wasn't a bull. You'd offer a male goat. And the blood was handled differently because none of it was taken into the sanctuary. Some of it was put on the altar outside. The rest was poured out. And again, the fat, all of it burnt up. But the rest of that offering, we read in chapter 6, verse 26, could be eaten by the priests. And then for individuals, just the common folk, not even the ruler of the tribe or the ruler of the household. So you're stepping down in value. It's not a male goat, it's a female goat. Blood was handled the same way as for the ruler. None of it went inside. And the priests could eat the rest. And some of you may have differing opinions on this. We'll explore it a little bit more, if not this week, next. But when that was done, look at chapter 4 and verse 35. After the priest had put some of it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, poured out the remaining blood, he shall remove all its fat, as the fat of the lamb is removed from the sacrifice of the peace offering. Then the priest shall burn it on the altar, according to the offerings made by fire to the Lord. So the priest shall make atonement for his sin that he has committed, and it shall be forgiven him. This is for a sin offering. And that happened, turn over to chapter 10, because the priest was considered to have borne the sin for the person. That's in 10, verses 17 and 18. What happened here, You remember the example that is often used, appropriately so, I think, for doing something religiously and not in God's not chosen way. Nadab and Abihu, remember that? Who offered strange fire on the altar? Well, these are Aaron's sons. Aaron was most distressed. He was supposed to have eaten from the offering. He was so upset that he didn't. And Moses has confronted him, starting in verse 17. Why have you not eaten the sin offering in a holy place, since it is most holy, and God has given it to you to bear the guilt of the congregation, to make atonement for them before the Lord? See, its blood was not brought inside the holy place. Indeed, you should have eaten it in a holy place, as I commanded. As if Aaron didn't feel bad enough, Moses is making him feel worse. But Aaron explains to Moses, I just couldn't do it on a day like this. And Moses accepted it. So why do I bring that up? That when the priest offered it, that was to make atonement for the people. In the context of the peace offering, again, there was provision for the poor. If you couldn't offer the female goat, you could offer 2 doves or 2 pigeons. If you didn't have them, you could actually make an offering out of flour. Pronunciation is hard. Not a rose, but what is that flour? Betty Crocker, that'll do. That kind of flour. You could make it out of that. But you didn't have to put oil or incense in it. Oil or incense drove up the cost. If you didn't have it, you could just make a flour offering as your sin offering. Some minutes ago, Jim mentioned sins of neglect, unintentional. The sin offering was for a person who missed the mark. That actually was the meaning of the Hebrew word. You have heard the Greek word hamartia, which in the New Testament is translated sin. That was the common meaning for the Greek word. Missing the mark. It's demonstrating there that deliberate sin, and I'll distinguish deliberate sin from the unpremeditated sin that Burton Kaufman talked about. There wasn't a sacrifice for that. And we see from the idea of unwittingly or unintentional, still sin. Ignorance of the law, what does that mean to you when the patrolman says you were going 55 in a 30-mile zone? Ignorance of the law is no excuse. You didn't see the sign, well, tough. You get a ticket because it doesn't excuse you. Missing the mark. And we all have done it. Sometimes unintentionally, sometimes intentionally. But that's a sin offering. There is also a guilt offering. Some of your versions call it trespass. That's in chapter 5, starting at verse 14, running down to the early part of chapter 6. Somewhat distinguished, I guess, from the sin offering, although sin and guilt and trespass are pretty similar. 2 categories there. Sins against God, sins against a neighbor. Against God, what could it be? Some people say, well, maybe the firstborn male, you'll recall, was to have a sacrifice made to redeem that male. Maybe the person didn't do it. So it's something with a value attached. The offering was a ram. And you offered the ram. The value of the lamb, what do you call that? Restitution, plus 20%. Now, the offerer would be inclined to say, well, hey, my ram really wasn't worth a whole lot and the market's bad right now. I'm going to lowball it. Didn't work that way. The priest valued the lamb. And he used a heavier valuation weight, a shekel, a heavier shekel than ordinary, so it would drive up the amount of restitution that was due. So that would be for sins against God, whatever specifically they may have been. Also, for wronging a neighbor. Turn to chapter 6, first 5 verses. And I'll go back to what Jim said earlier. This certainly sounds deliberate. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, if a person sins and commits a trespass against the Lord by lying to his neighbor, you're going to lie unintentionally? I don't think so. By lying to his neighbor about what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or about a pledge, or about a robbery, or if he has extorted from his neighbor, or if he has found what was lost and lies concerning it and swears falsely, all of this is deliberate. In any one of these things that a man may do in which he sins, then it shall be, because he has sinned and is guilty, that he shall restore what he has stolen, or the thing which he has deceitfully obtained, or what was delivered to him for safekeeping, or the lost thing which he found, or all that about which he has sworn falsely. He shall restore its full value, add 1/5 more to it, that's 20%, and give it to whomever he belongs on the day of his trespass offering. So he shall make the person he wronged whole with a penalty attached. That continues today. You read about a person who embezzles. What are they usually required to make? Restitution. And there are penalties on top of that. And then finally, and this is where we're going to end today in perfect time, the perpetual offering. It is not in these chapters. Turn over to Numbers 28. Numbers 28, verses 1 through 6. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the children of Israel and say to them, my offering, my food for my offerings made by fire as a sweet aroma to me. You've heard that before. You shall be careful to offer to me at their appointed time. You shall say to them, this is the offering made by fire, which you shall offer to the Lord. 2 male lambs in their first year without blemish, day by day, as a regular burnt offering. The 1 lamb you shall offer in the morning. The other lamb you shall offer in the evening. And 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of pressed oil. Morning and evening. More precisely, 9 o'clock and 3. When was Jesus nailed to the cross? 9 o'clock. About when did he die? 3. So the perpetual offering really presages Jesus, crucified at 9, dead at 3. Without even being there, we have shed a lot of blood. There were unbloody offerings as well. We'll look at that next week. We will also consider the abuses of sacrificing, because like I said, religious things tend to degrade, and in Israel they degraded. And also we want to talk about the significance of sacrifice for us today. That's where we'll pick up next time.